Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our second webinar of the year, Problematic Maintenance Scenarios. My name is Alina Gilbert. I will be presenting this webinar today. And for those of you who have done these before, you know what time it is. It is time for you to look at a meme and for me to do my housekeeping items. So the bulk of your screen should be the PowerPoint, the little kid under the car who needs some super glue. And like I said, I'm Alina Gilbert. You should be seeing me kind of to the left of the PowerPoint. Don't pay any attention to me. Just look at the PowerPoint. I'll just be talking. Now, on the right side of your screen, you should see a little chat icon. This is what you're going to use. If you have questions, type them in at any time. However, I will be waiting until the end of the presentation to answer any questions, sometimes because they get answered during the presentation and other times because, well, most of the time because I want to make sure we have enough time to go through the actual materials before we get to the questions. You will be receiving one CMCA credit for this. It will be automatically emailed to you. You should have it probably within the next 24 hours. We just need confirmation of everyone's attendance before it is sent. One thing to remember with the CMCA credit, you need to save the certificate either as a picture, or as a PDF or something to your computer because it disappears after about 30 days and you want to make sure you don't lose it and you have it. So please make sure that once you get that email, you separately save the certificate itself. A reminder, this presentation is going to be recorded and it will be put on our YouTube channel within the next probably 24 to 48 hours max. So if you find this very helpful, feel free to refer other folks to watch it. Only caveat is we cannot give you any CMCA credits if you watch it on YouTube. You can only get the credits watching it live. All right, if you have any issues during the presentation, as far as video, audio, there is a little button at the bottom that says issues with video or audio. Click on that button. It'll take you through a series of steps, and hopefully that will take care of the problem. And finally, there will be, as you know, a little survey that pops up at the end as soon as we're done. If you have time, we always appreciate any feedback you might have. I don't believe in good or bad feedback. It's feedback, and it helps us improve our presentations in the future. So please, if you have a minute, we really appreciate whatever information, whatever thoughts you have. Please share those with us. All right, I think we are done with that. So let's start. Let's start as in general, because anytime we are doing an analysis of maintenance repair situations, you always have to start with kind of the big picture and the broad rules. So the broad rules are the association, all things being equal, the association is going to maintain and be responsible for repairing common elements. Now this includes your general common elements and your limited common elements. Owners, on the other hand, are going to be responsible for maintaining and repairing their real property, which is like their units, their lots, and their personal property. So things that they own that are personal, that aren't part of the home. And it is really, really important that we start off with that premise. Where does it come from? Two places. One is Kiowa. For your post-Kiowa community, so post-1992, Kiowa specifically has a provision that says unless your declaration provides otherwise, association is responsible for the common elements, homeowners are responsible for their units, period, end of story. So, and for pre-Kiowa communities where that provision doesn't apply, we have common law, and common law has always been and continues to be, you are responsible for property you own, right? There's no other way to interpret that. You're responsible for the property you own unless you have an agreement shifting it to someone else. Okay, so what does that mean? What's the agreement? The agreement is generally our declaration. The declaration is what may legally shift responsibility for repairs and maintenance. The other thing that may shift it is if you have, and this is at law, if someone was negligent with respect to anything and they caused the damage, then we can shift then the responsibility to the negligent party. But that's about it. Okay, otherwise, everything being equal, associations, common elements, and owners are units and personal property. So let's talk about common elements, because this is, I think, one point where people get confused, especially with respect to condominiums. So we need to determine whether a component is a common element and how do we do that. And in this case, I think it's extremely important to understand the difference between condominium communities, I mean, from a legal perspective, and planned developments. A planned development is any kind of a community where the homeowners actually own the land on which their unit sits. By the same token, they actually own the structure. This would include your, of course, detached single-family home communities, your patio home communities, even your townhomes. It doesn't matter if they're connected by a wall. You can still own the land upon which your structure sits and the structural portions of your structure. So that's a planned development. How's it different than a condominium development? Well, a condominium development is actually where owners, they don't own any land. What they own is airspace. Airspace within usually the perimeter walls, floors, and ceilings of their units. So they don't per se own any land. The other thing to remember is in order to be a condominium community under Kiowa, your common elements are owned in common by all the homeowners. So technically your association does not own the common elements, but it's still responsible for their maintenance and repair. Okay, so that's something that is important to remember as well. So you got to always keep in mind when you're trying to figure out if something is a common element, whether or not we're dealing with a condominium community versus a planned development. Normally in a condominium community, anything lying outside the perimeter walls is going to be a common element. It could be a general common element, which means it's open to everybody to use. It could be a limited common element, which means it only services or is available to one or more owners as long as it's not all owners. So that's the difference between the general and limited common elements. Now, how do we figure out whether a component is a common element? Well, the first thing is you want to look in the declaration and you want to see how that term is defined. And a lot of times, of course, there are you're going to see examples of what constitutes a common element, and usually it's past the definitions. Usually you have separate sections that talk about common elements, limited common elements, things like that. There's also going to be definitions of other things like the units, right? You're going to look at the exhibits. Sometimes the exhibits to the declaration have some information, and you're absolutely going to look at the recorded maps. The condominium maps for the condominium communities usually will have a lot of LCEs on there and GCEs designated. So LCE for limited common element, GCE for general common element. And oftentimes the declaration won't necessarily tell us if something is a limited common element, but the recorded condominium map will. The plat map, that's for your planned developments, is going to show us the lot lines. And one thing to be very careful of when it comes to lot lines is there's so many associations out there that are convinced they know where the lot lines are for their buildings, for townhomes. And I would guess that 80% of the times they're wrong, because ultimately we can look at the map and it might give us an idea of like the shapes of the lots and things like that. But unless we do a survey that specifically identifies the lot lines in relation to buildings, you're not going to know exactly where the lot lines lie. And this becomes a really big deal when we talk about maintenance obligations with respect to townhomes, because a lot of times what the declaration will say is that the owner is responsible for maintenance inside the lot and the association is responsible for maintenance of the general or the common elements that lie outside the lot. And so if we don't know exactly where the lot line is, sometimes it's extremely difficult, if not impossible, to figure out where the homeowner's obligation ends and the association's begins. So these are all kind of complicated analyses that we have to deal with. Let's go. Now, again, so determining whether a component is part of a unit or part of the lot. Again, the lot lines, that would be in the plat map. We've got unit boundaries are typically defined in the declaration. And you're usually going to see something like the finished surfaces of the perimeter, walls, floors, and ceilings. And sometimes they give us a little bit more guidance and sometimes they don't, and that's all we have. So for example, who knows what a finished surface is? Is it the drywall? Is it just the paint on the drywall? What is it? The good news, at least for post-Kiowa communities, is that Kiowa actually has a provision that says if this is all you have in your declaration, perimeter, walls, floors, and ceilings, finished surfaces, then the drywall is actually going to be part of the unit, and basically everything beyond the perimeter drywall is not part of the unit. It's a common element. So that's a default, but it doesn't apply to pre-Kiowa communities. So we're kind of a little bit more in the gray when it comes to our pre-Kiowa communities. But again, finished surfaces. A lot of times boards can adopt resolutions clarifying what that means as well, because a finished surface is an ambiguous term, and if it's not defined, then especially with the pre-Kiowa communities, you can adopt a resolution saying this is how we interpret finished surfaces. It includes blah, blah, blah. It excludes everything else. And the boards have the ability to adopt rules clarifying terms that aren't clear in the declaration. The other issue that comes up is utilities. As you know, pipes, wires, cables, all that stuff is usually a big gray area for most, especially when it comes to condominium units. And so again, it's really important to be able to read through the declaration to see if you can determine whether a utility in a condominium constitutes a common element or part of the unit. It's always going to be fairly convoluted. However, in most cases, what I see is any type of a wire or a pipe or a line that is inside the actual walls of the unit and services only that unit is generally considered part of the unit. If any line or pipe that's in the unit but services more units than just that one is considered a common element. That's typically how it works. That is not always the case. You've got to look at the declaration to figure it out. So let's start. Let's start with some problematic scenarios. And our first one is going to be water damage inside a condominium unit from a leaking pipe. We have all seen this. This is something that comes up over and over again. This is a recurring theme, especially in our condominium communities. It's not, obviously, if it's a single family detached home, the answer's really easy. But when we have condominiums, it's not as easy. So we're going to go through an analysis that I think you can follow in every circumstance. And we'll go through it with a couple more scenarios here. But I think where you need to start is, all right, so we've got water damage. The water came from a leaking pipe. Let's start with the pipe. Okay, because that's kind of the cause of the damage. So where is the pipe located and who maintains it? So now we got to go back to what we just talked about. The default is if the pipe is a common element, it's going to be the association. If it's part of the unit, it's going to be the homeowner. But how do we know? So we are going to look again at the definition of common elements. We're going to look at the unit boundaries. We're going to figure out whether a utility that either runs through the unit or does not run through the unit, what does that constitute? And this is a legal analysis. So I'm not saying I expect everyone to go and kind of figure that out on their own without consulting legal counsel, but I think it's important to have an understanding of the steps that are involved in figuring these things out, and that it's not just, oh, let's just look at the maintenance and boom, we're done, right? So you need to figure out if the pipe is a common element, and we need to figure out who maintains the pipe, okay? So again, if it's a common element, if we determine it's a common element, what's the default? Association. But then you also have to look at the declaration to determine whether that is still an association responsibility, or is it shifted to the homeowner? For example, does it say that any pipes that, whether common elements or not, that are exclusively service one unit must be maintained by the owner? We see that. And the crux here is that you're going to have pipes that exclusively service one unit, but they actually lie outside the boundaries of the unit. They're kind of in that wall between the two units. Technically, that makes them common elements because it lies outside the unit boundaries, but the maintenance obligation has been shifted to the owner who gets the benefit of the pipe. So we can't always assume that just because it's a common element, it's association, or just because it's part of the unit, it's the homeowner. We always have to look at those maintenance provisions as well. So let's continue on. Once we've identified the pipe, okay, we need to look at the unit itself. It sounds like the unit incurred some damages. So we always need to know what specifically was damaged in the unit. I get a lot of emails from folks that say, hey, this unit had water damage, who's responsible for it? I can't just answer that. I need to know, first of all, what caused the water damage. I need to know what was damaged inside the unit itself. And then we need to figure out whether what was damaged is part of the unit or if it constitutes a common element, and who has the maintenance and repair obligation for the damaged component. So again, we need to know the unit boundaries of the condominium community, especially. We need to know, is the drywall part of the unit? Is it a common element? And regardless, is there a maintenance provision saying that all drywall is maintained by the homeowner or the association is responsible for drywall? A lot of times you're going to have to go back and forth among many provisions to get an answer, because anytime you see a capitalized term in your declaration, that typically means you need to flip back to the beginning of your declaration and look at the various definitions, because that's a defined term. And so you can't just assume when you read the word unit that you know what the unit is. We want to go and look at the definition and see what is a unit, what are its boundaries. You can't just assume it's something. All right. So again, once we know if the pipe's a common element and who maintains it, we need to figure out what was damaged inside the unit and ultimately who is responsible for the maintenance and repair of those components. Okay. So next we look at negligence or wrongdoing. Was there any? Now, we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but one point I really want to stress here is a lot of times I have boards and some managers will say, well, look, it doesn't matter if the pipe's a common element, it came from the common element, therefore the association has to fix everything. Or vice versa. There was a leak in the unit and it caused damage to common elements, and therefore the homeowner is responsible for it. That is absolutely the wrong analysis. And I'm just going to say that now. And like I said, we'll talk about it more later, but that is not how it works. There has to be some wrongdoing here, okay? So just because it came from a common element or just because it came from the unit doesn't automatically make that individual responsible for all the damages. Generally, if there is no negligence and there is no wrongdoing, then everyone's going to be responsible for their own thing, okay? So it doesn't matter where it came from. So in this case, you always want to ask if there was negligence or wrongdoing, because that may be a reason to shift some of that, repair requirement over to whoever was negligent, that party. Okay. Something to keep in mind also is the declaration will generally have provisions that say if the homeowner is negligent, then they're responsible, and we can tack it on as an assessment, which is good. But you want to be careful, because sometimes, especially in older documents, not so much in the newer one, we see language that says if the owner is negligent, and that's, it doesn't talk about their renters, their family members, their, invitees, their contractors. And if we don't have that language, it's going to make it much more difficult to recoup those costs from the owner, because there's nothing under law that says you as an individual are responsible for actions of your guests. These are third parties, independent third parties, and unless that language is in the declaration that says you are responsible for what your tenants do, you are responsible for what your guests do, and you are responsible for what your contractors do, there's a good argument to say no. You can't shift this to me as an owner. I had nothing to do with it. How can you shift it to me? So we need to make sure there's some language in the declaration allowing us to hold the homeowner responsible for things that cause damage that was done by their people, so to speak. Okay, so negligence itself it's a legal term, and we do hold classes to talk about negligence. But in short, here's how negligence is defined from a legal perspective. It means someone has a duty, someone breaches that duty, and a direct result of that breach is the damage. Okay, so let's take a scenario here. Let's say the association, we have a duty to maintain the roof in a condominium community or wherever. Okay, so that part's easy. We can always determine the duty by looking in the declaration. The hard part is going to be the breach. Because how do you prove someone breached their duty? Sometimes what needs to happen is you would need to show that, for example, the association knew there was a problem with the roof, but it didn't take any steps to correct it. The association knew there may be a problem, but they decided not to investigate the roof or see if there's something going on there. Those could all be bases for arguments that the association was negligent. Same thing with a homeowner. Homeowner left the water running in the bathtub and forgot about it and left. Okay, so that could be a basis for us to argue the homeowner was negligent. But sometimes it's, negligence is not very obvious. And so a lot of boards really go towards the negligence argument, and they want to basically shift all the costs back to a homeowner if we have damage originating from a unit. And the answer is it's very difficult to prove negligence. And so it's not automatic. And you're always going to get a response, at least from our office, when you send us emails that say, hey, what do we need to do to charge this owner back for this damage? We're going to come back and say, well, hold on a minute here. Tell us exactly what happened and what kind of documentation you have to establish that the homeowner did something wrong. And it works both ways, because it's the same thing for a homeowner to prove negligence of the association. So let's say in this case, the water leak was from a pipe that's a common element that the association has an obligation to maintain. Now, just because it came from that pipe doesn't necessarily mean the association did something wrong. Okay, because it might be an old pipe, who knows? It might be something that could not be predicted. So just because it came from the pipe does not automatically mean the association is responsible for the damage inside the unit if the owner has the repair obligation in there. But if the owner can prove that the pipe leaked because the association was negligent, it's the same burden of proof. It's going to be really difficult, but if they can prove it to a court, then a court would say, yes, association, you were negligent, therefore the pipe leaked, and the leak is what caused all the water damage inside the unit. Therefore, we have established negligence and you need to pay. It's a very complicated analysis, even though it sounds simple. So the lesson I want you to take from this is negligence is not an easy thing to prove. And I know we tend to use that term a lot. So just realize that it may not be negligence, even though you think it is. All right. I want to talk about insurance as well, because this comes into play a lot. So we're still with the water damage inside the unit from a leaking pipe. So is this an insurable claim? So the question here is this something that needs to be submitted by someone to insurance? And we have a lot of problems with this because a lot of times boards will not submit a claim, either thinking they don't have to or thinking that, you know, the homeowner caused this, therefore the homeowner should be responsible for it, and yada, yada, yada. And then they don't submit a claim when they should have. Again, this slide is a whole class I teach, which is at least an hour long on whether or not to submit a claim. But I'll give you the kind of short version of that. And that is what you got to look at is what happened an insurable claim? In most cases, water leak, water damage is going to constitute an insurable claim under the property policies of the associations and the homeowners who have individual policies. Okay, let's go on. Who insures the pipe? Well, in most cases, if it's a common element, it's going to be the association. Who insures the interior unit? So normally we say go look at your declaration. However, for a post-Kiowa community, so post-July 1, 1992, Kiowa has very specific requirements for association insurance when it comes, well, really to all associations, but especially for condominiums, because it says if you're a condominium unit, you or a condominium community, you association have to insure the units. Okay, so regardless of anything your declaration may say, you insure the units. However, you can exclude a couple of things. You can exclude finished surfaces, which is what? Paint, wallpaper, paneling, carpeting, padding, you know, things like that. And you can exclude owner upgrades. So if I, as an owner, upgraded my countertop and I put in whatever quartz countertop instead of what it came, the laminate it came with, at that point, then I would be responsible for insuring that countertop. However, if it's the original countertop, then technically the association is still responsible for all those originally installed fixtures. Okay. Also, of course, homeowners are responsible for their personal property. So in a condominium community, a lot of times associations don't even realize that they're insuring the units, and they figure, hey, if the damage is inside the unit, well, that's not our problem. It's not our job to submit an insurance claim. The homeowner needs to submit it to their carrier. And that, of course, is not the right analysis here. So again, I always recommend consulting, well, first of all, asking your insurance broker whether or not any portions are insured by the association, but I would also recommend talking with your legal counsel because they're going to approach it from the perspective of, do you have a legal obligation to submit a claim? If you do have a legal obligation, but you don't submit the claim, here's what could happen. You're going to have, first of all, maybe the homeowner's insurance will cover some of it, and then they're going to come after the association to recoup what they paid because the association has a duty to submit a claim. Or the homeowner is going to pay and then sue the association. And ultimately, the association would be responsible for anything insurance would have covered and possibly even the deductible. So you want to be careful with these types of situations. and err on the side of caution and check with your professionals as to whether or not you need to submit a claim. The other thing we look at is the damage more than the deductible? If we have a $10,000 deductible and we have $5,000 worth of damage, we know insurance isn't going to pay anything, so we would not submit a claim in that case. However, I'm going to get in my little soapbox here. However, if you do not have a deductible allocation policy, there is a very good chance that you are going to be stuck paying it if it's an association claim, even if you didn't submit one. And the reason is, especially for post-Kiowa communities, Kiowa has some language that basically says that ultimately the association has to pay the whole thing, unless, including the deductible, unless it has a deductible policy. The association's responsible for everything, except it can shift the deductible to the homeowner through a policy, or if the homeowner is negligent, then Kiowa says we can shift it to that homeowner. So for those of you who don't have deductible policies that specifically dictate how your deductibles are going to be allocated when a claim is submitted, you are running a pretty huge risk that you might be stuck at some point paying that deductible, even though we didn't have to submit a claim because it's less than the deductible. So I would urge everyone, check your documents, see if you have this policy. If you don't, I would very much encourage you to reach out to your legal counsel, whoever that may be, and ask them about drafting the deductible policy for your community so that you are protected. And the claim submission analysis is just what we talked about, whether or not we submit a claim. So if it's an insurable event, and if the damage is over the deductible amount, and if we insure the damaged components, regardless of whether they're in the unit or in the common area, we really have a duty to submit a claim to the carrier, or we pay out of pocket what insurance would have paid, even if it's not our maintenance responsibility. It's complicated, and people hate insurance, except for some of us geeks. But people don't like insurance. It's convoluted, but you should always be reaching out to your professionals to get an opinion if you're not sure which way to go. All right, let's go to a different one. Let's go to a different scenario. Basement flooding. All right, well, that's really, really broad, right? Of course, it's going to depend. What is it, a condominium? Is it a townhome? What kind of community are we talking about? But in general, when we look at a scenario like this, the first question is, well, where'd the water come from? And as you can see, it says expert opinion, because we as board members, we as community managers, we as attorneys don't have the expertise to determine where that water came from. Sometimes we think it's really obvious, but here's kind of the kicker is, if you don't get an expert opinion, you're exposing yourself to liability, because you have to conduct your due diligence as a board. And you have a fiduciary obligation to make educated decisions. And the problem is, if you're venturing a guess, oh, we have negative slope, or oh, we need to seal the window, or whatever, you may be completely wrong. And getting an expert opinion, this is the cool part, if you get an expert opinion and you rely on your expert opinion, you as a board are insulated from liability. Okay, so it doesn't mean you can't get sued, can't stop people from suing other people, but it means if you do get sued, then you present your report from your engineer or whoever, and you say, this is what we got, this was the recommendation, and we did exactly what was recommended, so we followed an expert opinion. So it doesn't mean the expert has to be correct. The expert could be way wrong, but you're going to be insulated from liability as a board because you followed it. You would have no reason to know that the opinion is wrong. The expert could have an exposure to liability, but you as a board would not. So for this reason alone, I tell boards, look, you guys don't get paid enough to not get an expert opinion. You need one to protect yourself. All right, so by same token, we figure out, the expert tells us where the water came from, and then the expert needs to tell us, do we need to make any repairs? And if so, what are the repairs? Okay, so again, let's assume if we're talking about like a single family detached home, we don't care, right? It's going to be that owner's responsibility. We have no responsibility for a single family home as far as what happens in their basement. That's their issue. We're not going to worry about it, right? So obviously this isn't going to apply in that kind of a scenario. If it's a townhome community, you need to know whether or not we have any kind of responsibility with respect to the basement. And is it the basement? What if the basement was finished? Do we have any responsibility for like the finished portion of it? Or is that all homeowner? So there's a little, you got to look into it. You got to figure out whether the association even has any responsibility with respect to the basement. And again, do we have any kind of an insurance obligation when it comes to the basement? So once we get the expert opinion, we need to know, well, if there's a repair that's dictated in there, who is responsible for that repair? Is it a repair, for example, is there something actually going on with the slab? Is there a big crack in the slab that needs to get repaired? Is there something wrong with the window well? Is there a big, gap there and we need to fix that? Who needs to fix that? So once we know what the issue is, then we can run the analysis of, do we have any obligation as an association to make these repairs? If we don't, we don't. However, we also want to run through the negligence consideration. So even though we may not be responsible for the window well, did it come from a negative slope? And should we have known that the common area outside the window had a negative slope? Should we have known? Did we know? Did we fail to take proper action? So that would be the secondary analysis of that. And again, is this something that should be submitted to insurance? Probably not. Groundwater, so anytime you have water coming from the ground flowing into the basement, is an exclusion under property policies. So it's most 99% of the time, you're not going to have any kind of coverage for that anyway. Right. So that would be an example of a similar analysis when it comes to a flooded basement. Let's do one more. Mold growth. All right. Again, it's not much here by way of what kind of a community it is, but we get complaints all the time, right? Hey, I got mold in my unit. I got black mold in my unit. You need to come take care of it, or I'm going to die. I have asthma. This is your fault, association, because the water came from a common element. Now I have mold, right? You've all heard that one before. So again, we obviously need to know what kind of a community we're dealing with, and we need to know where the mold is located. And because is the location of the mold a location that the association is responsible for, or that the owners are responsible for? If it is the owners, you can basically say, hey, we don't maintain this component, so you better take care of it. If it is like behind the drywall or somewhere that's considered a common element or a portion that the association maintains, and we get allegations of mold, at that point, we probably want to conduct some mold testing. Again, this is just due diligence. And I know there are so many boards that are like, well, we're not going to jump just because an owner says so. Just because they think there's mold doesn't mean we have to do all this mold testing. Technically, that's correct. But ultimately, if you don't, and then there does turn out to be mold, do you really want that liability exposure? Generally, once you know there may be cause for repairs or something may be wrong with a component the association maintains, there really is a due diligence requirement that we at least look into it and see if there's any truth to it. So I would recommend doing the mold testing. It's assuming there's mold. Mold testers can tell you approximate origination date. And So if the homeowner's saying, oh, this mold originated from, the rainstorm we had 2 weeks ago because my roof leaked, most of the time, your mold testers are going to say, no, this originated like a year ago or whenever. So that's a handy tool to have to say, well, it wasn't anything the association did. This originated a lot longer ago than when, we had the roof leak 2 years ago. And even if it did originate from the roof leak, we got to go back to the analysis of, was there any wrongdoing by the association with respect to the maintenance of the roof? Because if there wasn't, it's every man for himself. We would repair the roof, and if this is and if the mold is growing somewhere inside the unit that is the owner's responsibility, then the owner would have to fix that issue. Okay. Now, insurance considerations. I know there's a lot of associations that are like, yeah, but we have mold coverage, so we're good. It's not actually as good as it sounds. Depending on who you go through for your policy, just know that to get coverage for mold remediation, the mold has to be discovered within, again, depending on your policy, 14 days of when it began sporing and 21 days, so 2 or 3 weeks, depending on your policy. 99% of the time, you are not going to discover mold growth within 2 or 3 weeks. It's going to be a slow process, and my guess is you won't know anything about it for at least a year when the homeowner starts noticing it or when it finally comes to the board's attention, which means even if you have coverage and you submit it, it's going to be denied because it's going to be more than 2 or 3 weeks. So just don't rely on your insurance coverage with respect to mold, if that's what you've been doing when homeowners tell you they have mold. I think that, again, there's a duty to investigate, figure out where it's coming from, where it's located, who has repair obligations for those components, and whether or not, of course, there was any kind of negligence involved by anyone, whether the association or the owner, that may have caused that. That is the overall analysis you're going to do, and it's going to apply to pretty much all your maintenance issues, no matter how complicated and no matter how simple. But, obviously the more complicated it gets, the more convoluted the analysis becomes, and that's when it gets to be that everyone gets confused and nobody knows what to do. So do not hesitate to make sure you're looking at the whole problem, you're consulting with your experts before doing anything. That is really important to keep the board protected. All right, let's talk about where we go wrong. And a lot of these we've already talked about, but let's go through them. Strict liability analysis. So that is basically when you say, if it came from a common element, the association is responsible for all damages. If it came from the unit, the homeowner is responsible for all damages. Because it came from your unit, it doesn't matter whether there was any wrongdoing by the party. Simply because it came from here, it's your responsibility. That's called strict liability. Colorado is not a strict liability state. So unless your declaration specifically says, if it came from the common element, association has to cover everything, or vice versa, you don't. So it's not automatic liability for someone just because it came from their unit. So in Colorado, we are a negligent state, which means there has to be some proof of wrongdoing before you can shift the repair obligations from the party where the damage originated from the party who has the repair obligation to the party where the damage originated. There you go. I got myself confused there. Sorry. Okay, so just remember that, and kind of to piggyback on that, this is oftentimes that a problem because associations don't submit insurance claim because they are under the impression that, well, the homeowner was stupid, the homeowner was negligent, and they caused the damage. So why would we use the association's policy to submit a claim? This is absolutely the wrong way to think about it. As I always like to say, insurance is there to protect us from our own stupidity. I mean, it really is, because we're human and we do stupid things, so we make mistakes. And that's why we all have insurance. And so therefore, saying someone was stupid, therefore we're not going to submit a claim doesn't work. And remember, the homeowners, under Colorado law and under basically common law, it's their policy. They pay for it with their assessments. There really is no such thing as like, oh, this is the association's policy and we get to dictate when we submit claims. It doesn't work that way. Homeowners are additional insureds on the policies, and they kind of all share in the risk of somebody being stupid. That's why it's like a common interest community. We all share in the interests and the benefits and the detriments. So just because my stupid neighbor caused the fire, I didn't do anything wrong as the other neighbor, but you know what? Association's still gonna have to submit a claim. And if our premiums go up next year because of that, I share in that risk. So don't not submit a claim just because a homeowner did something wrong and caused the damage. Next, incorrect assumptions as to maintenance and insurance obligations. I see that a lot. Associations, again, they assume they know, like you don't know what you don't know, right? So associations assume, no, we don't insure this, or, well, this is the responsibility of the homeowner, not the association, only to find out once legal reviews it that, sorry, you've been doing it wrong. I mean, obviously, you don't always know, but this is where I push maintenance and insurance charts to association. This is the chart where basically it sets forth all the various components in the community, and then there's a column for maintenance and repairs and a column for insurance, and they'll all have an A or an O for association or owner, so it's easy to look and see for the various components who has the obligation. And I always recommend getting those. I mean, they're not cheap, but they're very helpful when you have situations like this. So don't assume you know. And finally, associations go wrong when they don't retain experts to determine the root cause of the problem. We're not engineers. And even if we did have a board member who was an engineer, you certainly don't want to be that board member offering an engineering opinion because you're a board member. And that could either constitute a conflict of interest, or it could expose you to a lot more liability exposure because you're advising the association while you're a board member. So I wouldn't recommend that at all. You want an expert. You want a third party that's neutral. You want them to give you an opinion and recommendations, because that is really the only true way to insulate yourself from liability. All right. I know there's a lot more to talk about, but you know, we have an hour. So trust me, I'm an engineer. Hopefully that's not the kind of engineer you consult with when you are looking into problems. All right, I'm going to go through questions now. So let me I always have trouble with this mouse. We have a lot. I may not get through all of them, but we got 12 minutes. So let's see. Can you address gas line riser and who is responsible for its maintenance? Our community manager states, even though the gas meters are on the outside of the buildings, the gas line is the owner's responsibility to repair, bearing in mind the riser comes up from the ground and is then connected to a separate line leading to the unit. This, honestly, we don't know, because this is one of those things that you gotta review the governing documents for. It's going to be very specific to what the documents say, and if not, then you gotta defer to common law in Kiowa that says if it's a common element, it's the association, and if it's part of your unit or on your lot, it's the homeowner. So I couldn't give you that answer today because it's going to be in your documents or common law. What about when an owner argues that the HOA issue damaged their property and wanted taken care of by the HOA? Again, homeowners can argue so many things, but I always say if we have reason to believe that there is a defect in a common element that may be causing damage, we really should be diligent and have it looked at and investigated, because if there's something wrong and we don't fix it, there's going to be a problem, because now we have noticed that there may be a problem and we're not doing anything with it. If the governing documents don't specifically list the perimeter fence, would it be considered an improvement? Fences are generally considered improvements, but as far as maintenance goes, again, you got to go through the analysis of whether or not the association or the owner is required to maintain it. I'm a new board member. Can you please explain what CIWA is? Yes, it's an acronym for the Colorado Common Interest Ownership Act. It is a statute that governs HOAs in Colorado, so it's like a big deal. It's what we go to. Do the details need to live in the declaration, or if the declaration is generalized, can the details of definitions be defined in subordinate documents such as a policy or procedure, especially if the declaration specifies the determination of such lies with the association? You can use policies to define ambiguous terms in the declaration. However, your policies and your rules cannot conflict with anything that is in the declaration. So it's a fine line, but yes, you can define ambiguous terms and policies. I always say work with your attorneys on that so that they can make sure you aren't, conflicting with provisions in your declaration. With negligence, must it be willful intent, or also includes done by accident or a lack of enough knowledge? It's not willful intent, because then that would be basically a willful whatever, disregard or whatnot. And negligence is stupidity, honestly. Again, you have a duty to maintain something, you didn't do it for whatever reason, and because you didn't do it, that caused the damages. An exhaust pipe for a gas fireplace that is only used by the homeowner has a bird nest in the cap at the end of the pipe on the exterior of the townhome. I want to verify that would be the homeowner's responsibility. Again, the problem is we don't know without looking at the documents. A lot of times with townhome communities, the association is responsible for repairing the roofs and the chimneys and things like that, and arguably could be the association's responsibility. So the problem here is it's not a one size fits all, and so we always need to look at the declaration before we can make a final judgment on that. Does the association have to have a loss assessment clause in the declaration in order to issue a loss assessment? So I'll be honest with you, the term loss assessment is not a legal term. And I know insurance companies use that a lot, but it's loss assessment coverage, which means it is coverage for assessments that are imposed by associations to cover a loss. Now that could be a special assessment. It could be an assessment to cover the insurance deductible. It could be all sorts of things. But a per se loss assessment is not really a legal term, and you're typically not going to see that language in any set of covenants. You're definitely not going to see it in the statute. So don't give too much credence to that term. Who determines expertise? So that's a good question. Who is an expert, really? An expert is someone who's a professional in the pertinent industry. So if you have a legal question, you go to an attorney, right? If it's something structural, you want to go to a structural engineer. If it's something to do with landscaping, you go, to a landscaping professional. Those are the experts, so to speak. They're people who specialize in whatever the topic is. And unless you have reason to know that the person you're going to doesn't know what they're talking about, you can rely on their like certifications as an expert on their, the fact that they're landscapers, or the fact they're horticulturists, or that they're engineers. You can rely on that. But if you know that this person who says they're an engineer, they're really not, or they don't know what they're doing, and you use them anyway, if you do that, then it's not going to count as an expert. But otherwise, almost anyone. What about self-insuring and the association pays for a minimal loss for which the association is responsible to prevent the possibility of increased premiums due to the claim's history? Yeah, there is that. That's a lot right there. If you're a post-Kiowa community, Kiowa requires full replacement value for all your property coverage. So you would be violating statutory requirements. So a lot of associations have full replacement coverage requirements in their declaration. So you really would need to review what your documents say, and depending on whether you were created before 1992 or after, you may or may not be able to do it. I know assessments, premiums are so expensive. And like I said, we do whole classes on that, but ultimately, you have to do your best to try and stay within the confines of what's required of you, but also to manage the ability to pay and to manage your premiums. A lot of times we see associations amending their declaration and shifting insurance obligations to homeowners to kind of reduce their requirements so that the premiums can go down, and assessments can sometimes go down also. So that's always something to look into. How do you hold an owner responsible in a condominium building that has a roach problem affecting other units? I know we can demand they treat, but I assume they would have to provide proof of treatment and notes from the exterminator to show it has been mitigated. And do we tell other owners that if they are seeking compensation, they would have to deal with the problem owner directly? Possibly. Whenever we have any kind of vermin infestations, like bed bugs, cockroaches, mice, you name it, it's always very, very difficult for anyone to prove where the problem originated. How are you going to prove that the roach infestation originated with this particular unit? Because roaches are going to spread. They're not just going to stay in one unit. So it's going to be very difficult to pin it on one person. But, in those situations, it's very complicated. Usually the association is going to have to exterminate if there's like common element hallways. Owners will exterminate their units. You're going to need to have all the surrounding unit owners submit something saying either they've been inspected and they have no cockroaches, or they have cockroaches and they've exterminated, because it's not going to be just one unit. So it's a fairly complicated analysis. And again, you'd probably want to go through legal counsel on that one. Sorry, we got like 2 minutes left, so I'll see how much I can get in. If recommendation is to always claim, how do you prevent your carrier from dropping you? That's a great question. Again, it's not always to claim. You have to have the damages have to be higher than the deductible. And a lot of times, most of the time now, associations carry very high deductibles and the damage doesn't exceed that. So ultimately, it's not going to be as often as you think. The other option is you pay out of pocket as the association, so you don't have to submit. In addition to deductible policies, do you recommend a water event policy to outline who is responsible for what? Yeah, absolutely. There are water leak policies out there that can be drafted. Certainly we can prepare them, that talk about the analysis and kind of how that's handled at any given time. So certainly you should ask your legal counsel about that. How do we get condominium association maps? You probably already have them. They're recorded with the county, just like plat maps. And so typically developers give them to us. If not, we can always go get them from the clerk and recorders online. All right, it's 1 o'clock. I apologize if I didn't get to your question. There's my email. Just reach out and I'll try to get back to you within a couple of days. Thanks again. Please do the questionnaire, the survey when it pops up if you can. I appreciate you guys joining us today. We'll see you next time.